We are back for the second half of our second video in our series. I'm George Maxwell, author of Agent of Mercy, the untold story of Dr. Archibald S. Maxwell, Civil War surgeon and Iowa State sanitary agent. Please like the video and subscribe if you want to watch future videos in this series or watch prior videos from earlier in the series. The videos are all done by me, and I apologize for any minor mistakes in videography or otherwise. Like or comment as you see fit to point out how I might improve. And so with this second half of the second video, we continue our discussion of the history of medical assistance and aid provided by Iowa citizens to its soldiers during the U.S. Civil War. When we last met, I had explained the politics of Iowa soldiers' aid during the Governor Kirkwood administration. He was the governor during the first several years of the U.S. Civil War. We also touched briefly on Governor Kirkwood's mistake, in my opinion, which was to exclude women leaders in the Soldiers' Aid movement from his state sanitary commission that he created in October of 1861. And we also discussed how the women in those various local aid societies, who were in many parts led by the Keokuk Ladies Aid Society and Annie Whitmire, its corresponding secretary, how those responded to the state commission's attempt to assert authority over them and dictate terms of how their volunteer activities would work. Big hint, they didn't like it very much, and they had real reasons why they had reasons to object, and many of those reasons were founded in how the state commission wanted to go about distributing the aid. We had also discussed the first efforts of the commission to do a survey as well in Missouri of all the various regiments that were located there in order to figure out what kind of medical aid was needed. And we also discussed the Soldiers' Aid Society groups' provision of aid after the Battle of Belmont, Missouri in November of 1861. As you may recall, this was one of Grant's first early battles, and it was, some believe, a dress rehearsal for the next battle to come, which were the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. And so, without further ado, we'll discuss the assistance that they provided to Iowa soldiers after the Battle of Fort Donelson. This video is not about the movement of armies and who did what to whom, but it's really hard to discuss the medical aid aspects after the battles in the abstract. I find maps absolutely essential to understanding why a battle took place, why provisioning and providing medical aid was difficult, particularly at some of these early battles. And so I have a map here of the confluence of Missouri and Illinois and Kentucky and Tennessee, where the Ohio and the Mississippi come together, and where the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers go north and join the Ohio River. And you can so that you can kind of understand the geography of where these battles took place and how far the distances are. So the Confederacy in the West had set up a line of forts and other strong points to defend its western extent. And control of the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers was essential to controlling the state of Tennessee and northern Mississippi and Alabama, because whoever controlled those rivers could use them to go quite far into western parts of into Tennessee and into northern Mississippi and northern Alabama. And to defend that, the Confederacy had built Fort Henry on the Tennessee, and not far away had built Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. In the combined arms, in a combined arms coordinated attack with his army and riverboat gunships, Grant moved on Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and took it February 6th with very few casualties. Partially it had to do with the fact that at the time Fort Henry was really close to the river and it was partially flooded. And so the Confederates basically abandoned the fort and sent the troops over to Fort Donelson. Grant then marched his army on Fort Donelson across the narrow neck of land there that separates the Tennessee and the Cumberland River. And the Union Army proceeded to try to besiege the Confederates. The Confederates tried to break out of the fort. They really had more men in the fort than the fort was designed to accommodate, which is why they had additional siege works, and also were the reason that they tried the breakout. The breakout was unsuccessful, and one of the reasons it was unsuccessful was Grant saw that one side of the fort was left with few soldiers to defend it, and had ordered an attack by the Iowa 2nd and several other regiments, but the Iowa 2nd Infantry led the attack, and it was able to breach several rings of the fort's defensive works, took very heavy casualties in the effort, but breaching those works basically made holding the fort further untenable. And after several of the Confederates left during the night, Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner surrendered the fort unconditionally to General Grant. In the Battle of Fort Donelson, the Union Army suffered over 2,000 wounded and over 500 dead. 160 of the wounded were from the Iowa 2nd, which, as I had mentioned, had led the charge that breached the fort. And two of those companies that took significant casualties were Company C and Company D, and they were from Scott County, Iowa. The officers in the Iowa 2nd had wired individuals in Davenport and in other parts of Iowa to request help, medical help, medical aid, further assistance, because they knew that they would need it. And they did that on or around February 16th. The reason that they wired for assistance and additional medical aid from folks in Iowa was because it was pretty clear very early on that the surgeons with the Army were overwhelmed and didn't have adequate supplies, medical supplies, or assistance to treat all the wounded. You have to remember, in February, it's still pretty cold in Tennessee, and Fort Donelson is in a more rural part of Tennessee, so there weren't a lot of available shelter for the wounded. And 4 days after the battle, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, led by Dr. Newberry, showed up on its own steamer with supplies to try and help out. And Dr. Newberry, in his report, which he wrote at the end of the war, described the conditions, which were just awful. it was quite clear that wounded weren't getting adequate care, even though the surgeons and assistant surgeons were doing everything they could. In fact, even General Grant mentions it briefly, it's only a sentence or two, in his memoirs. There just weren't enough tents. There weren't enough people to help out with all of the wounded. And there wasn't adequate good nutritional food to feed the wounded. They didn't have they didn't have enough clean clothing, clean changes of clothing to get soldiers out of dirty, dusty uniforms, blood-soaked uniforms, and it was just quite clear that they were overwhelmed by the situation. And due to the lack of shelter and the inability to treat them at the battlefield site, a decision was made to basically load them on steamers and ship them all up to hospitals that had been established along the Ohio and the Mississippi River system earlier in the war. And one such hospital is the hospital at Mound City in Illinois, just not too far from Cairo. And the evacuation was fairly chaotic in the sense that you had individuals separated and shipped just to whichever hospital would potentially take them or had room for them, or whichever hospital the ship happened to dock itself at. And so locating wounded and figuring out who was wounded, who was dead, who was located in which hospital at first, right after the battle, was extremely difficult. Within 3 days of the battle being over, the battle ended on February 16th, the governor and the Iowa State Army Sanitary Commission had gotten a citizens' meeting called in Davenport on the night of February 19th at the Leclerc House to discuss providing medical aid and relief to Iowa wounded. And the citizens that gathered there were very interested in ensuring that this extra aid was provided and extra assistance was provided. But they also were highly interested in finding out who was wounded and where those wounded were located, so that they might receive assistance if necessary from their families, and who had died. And this meeting was basically the Davenport men finally getting involved in providing soldiers aid because the women of Davenport were already well involved, well ahead of them, months ahead of them in organizing. In fact, there are at least two Ladies' Aid Societies. One was the German Ladies' Aid Society, and the other one was the Davenport Ladies' Aid Society, which had been organized months before. The men gathered that night, and they collected well over $700 in donations, in addition to the medical supplies that were donated. They selected 4 individuals that they were going to send this medical aid and money with. 2 of them were doctors. Dr. Archibald S. Maxwell, who claimed he attended the meeting because the governor had written and asked him to, and Dr. McCairn. Dr. McCairn was selected because apparently he spoke German, and a good number of the Company C and Company D volunteers from the Davenport area were drawn from the local German immigrant population. And the other 2 men were L.C. Burwell and L.J. Center. It's worthwhile remembering those names, as they were consistent volunteers as well, even though they weren't doctors. This group of 4 was chosen to accompany a larger group that the governor was sending down to meet him at the Fort Donelson battlefield itself. One of them, the leader of this group, was Ira Gifford, who was a local elected Republican. He was elected to the clerk of court, which was an elected position at that point in time, and he was quite popular and had volunteered for these kind of medical aid distribution in connection with the Battle of Beaumont before, and so he was known to the governor, and the governor trusted him. In addition to Ira, also Judge Linderman went, and William Burroughs. This group of men would eventually, with some prodding from the Iowa State Army Sanitary Commission's Reverend A.J. Kynette, would eventually organize itself and call itself the Scott County Soldiers Relief Association. And we'll talk about them later on in another video, but it's worthwhile remembering that this group does evolve into a more well-standing association that provides relief for Iowa soldiers. So right after, the morning after the meeting on the 19th, on February 20th, they boarded a steamer in Davenport. That's if you look at the map, that's showing here. The steamer is leaving Davenport, and it's going down the Mississippi all the way to Cairo, Illinois, at the very bottom. I love maps. It helps us get familiar with the geography here, and so you can see the span that they took and how and they were they'd made it to Cairo by the night of the 22nd. So basically 2 days travel by steamer down the Mississippi. The night when they arrived, their first focus was to corner an officer, an Iowan, and interview him about what he knew about wounded and dead. And they immediately wired that information back to Davenport so it could be passed on. They went to sleep, and that night a steamer with wounded pulled in, called the Hazel Dell. And so on the morning of February 23rd, Dr. Archibald S. Maxwell and some of his group went down to the Hazel Dell that had arrived the night before, along with several others from other groups that had converged on Cairo to provide medical aid. The other half of the group went to see the general officer about getting a pass, because you couldn't get further than Cairo without a pass. And so they went to get a pass so that they could go visit other hospitals, and also perhaps go to Fort Donelson. And Dr. Archibald would later describe the Hazel Dell, the ship that he went to visit, for the people of Davenport in a letter that he had published in the Davenport Daily Gazette. And he had nothing good to say about the conditions of the steamer Hazel Dell. I have on this slide, and we'll show in the video, a purpose-built steamer hospital called the Red Rover. These kind of steamer hospitals would, after Fort Donelson, and become more standard, and a number of groups, the Army and various states and the sanitary commissions, would fit out these hospital ships so that you could provide, so that it was like a floating hospital. And there's a picture. The picture above is of a nice, representation of what the inside of the hospital ship looked like. The Hazel Dell was not such a hospital ship. It was just a steamer, and it had 153 wounded on it, 83 Union soldiers, and 73 Southerners. Didn't have much else to speak of. The wounded lay throughout the ship in their dirty, bloody uniforms. This is 6 days after the battle. They're still in their dirty, bloody uniforms, and there was not a bandage on the ship, and there wasn't the ability to create warm meals or to make food that you could feed to the wounded. There weren't any utensils. Somebody had thrown in marching rations, which is cracker bread and maybe some bacon or some beef smoked shoulder, but that wasn't, you couldn't expect a wounded guy who was fairly weak and maybe hadn't eaten for a while to be able to eat that. They wanted to feed him broth, and they had no utensils or a pot that you could use to try and create broth. There weren't any bandages on the ship, and there wasn't a surgeon, from which, because there weren't any bandages on the ship and there wasn't a surgeon or a nurse, Archibald basically deduced that most of the wounded their wounds had been treated once shortly after the battle, and they had no bandages had been changed since then. They'd just been loaded on the ship, so things were pretty dire. So what Dr. Archibald and his group of volunteers did, including a number of women who'd arrived, they tore up the women's petticoats and used them to rebandage and examine all the wounds of the wounded, so that they all got a good medical exam and their bandages got replaced. And once that was done, it was time to move on further down river. They had gotten their pass. While the individuals who weren't doctors had gotten their pass to move on, Dr. Archibald S. Maxwell and Dr. McCarran were told that they had to go to Paducah to see General Sherman to get a pass from him, which they did. And once they were in Paducah, they provided some medical assistance and then boarded a ship and went back to Mound City. Mound City is where you can see there's a green line that connects Cairo to Mound City on the Ohio River. Mound City was where they were building turtle ships, and it was also where there was a very large hospital. The Union Army Medical Corps, under Surgeon John H. Brinton, had selected some empty warehouses along the river and had converted them into a hospital earlier in the war, back in 1861. The warehouses had been divided into 24 different wards, which could accommodate between 1,200 and 1,400 wounded. By the time of the Battle of Fort Donelson, Dr. Franklin was the chief surgeon in charge. Dr. Archibald arrived from Paducah. Dr. Archibald and McCarran arrived and joined the rest who were waiting for them at Mound City at the hospital. And they provided assistance over several days to Iowa soldiers. In his report from this period, Dr. Archibald does not describe in glowing terms the Mound City Hospital or the doctors that were managing it. By the time his report was written, Mound City had quite the reputation as not being a great hospital or a well-run one either. And Dr. Franklin would become the subject of a formal complaint by Iowa Judge Wright, which led to an investigation and Dr. Franklin was ultimately cleared by that investigation because the conclusion was Dr. Franklin was doing the best he could with the very limited resources that the Army Medical Corps and the quartermaster could provide to him at the time. But suffice to say that there was a lot of dissatisfaction about the medical care that the Iowa soldiers were getting at Mountain City Hospital. And after the Battle of Fort Donelson, when the Iowa volunteers, medical aid volunteers arrived, they basically found the hospital completely overwhelmed, unable to really address the additional surge of wounded. And a few days, by February 26th, after they had arrived, the hospital was out of bandages, for instance, which is, if you think about it, a hospital with no bandages, that's pretty bad, right? That means that you have real problems with logistical issues and making sure that your needs are being met of your wounded. So just as an example of how the Iowa, Dr. Archibald S. Maxwell and Dr. McCarran and the other volunteers, what they did for Iowa soldiers. They found the standard bearer for the Iowa 2nd, Sergeant H.B. Doolittle. He'd been shot in 3 places and apparently had been getting better until he came down with erysipelas, which is a localized skin infection, can lead to fevers and vomiting. Today, it can be treated with antibiotics. Back then, things were more dire, and they had a whole ward full of soldiers that had come down with erysipelas, and obviously the prognosis wasn't good. The sergeant was told he had maybe days to live. Well, they decided, Dr. Archibald decided that the only way that the sergeant was going to survive is if he wasn't in the hospital. So they had him checked out, and they rented a house in Cairo, and 2 individuals, Judge Linderman and L.G. Center, stayed there and nursed him back to health, and he eventually does actually return as a captain, survives the war, and doesn't die until the 1890s. But when Sergeant Doolittle got back, he did provide his thoughts on his experience at Mound City. No surprise, he called it a living grave, which isn't an endorsement of any kind. The conditions in the hospital were pretty bad, and the decision was made that they would approach the administration and get the Iowa guys out, which they did. But some of the group, Ira Gifford and Dr. McCarran, had to leave. They left February 25th because they needed to meet Governor Kirkwood and Iowa Surgeon General Hughes and a number of other Iowa dignitaries that were going to Fort Donelson to visit the troops there on the 27th. But on the 26th, so the day after Ira Gifford left, Dr. Archibald S. Maxwell and the rest of the group, Mr. Burwell, they decided that they would get them out, and they got a steamer to put them on to evacuate all of the Iowa wounded out of this hospital, which by the 26th, as I said, had run out of bandages. So let's make no mistake, there was a political dimension to providing this medical aid. It was obviously to the Iowa soldiers. It was obviously the right thing to do, but these soldiers were also voters, and they also had families that voted. And so let's not forget the political dimension here. And that's why the governor was highly involved and highly interested. As I mentioned, it was the right thing for him to do, but the right thing also had a political dimension. And his trip to visit the Iowa 2nd Infantry Regiment at Fort Donelson was his way of going to laud their bravery in having stormed the fort and earned the honor. But the Iowa 2nd also wanted to return something to, with him, so that so that a token of the honor they had achieved in battle could be brought back to Iowa. And in this case, that was their battle standard. He was given the battle standard so it could be displayed in the Iowa House of Representatives at Fort Donelson. And along with Governor Kirkwood, Ira Gifford, and Dr. McCairn, there was also member Kellogg from the Iowa House had tagged along. And part of the reason that Dr. McCairn came there was to reassure the Iowa soldiers that all was being done that could be done to ensure that their comrades in arms that were wounded, 160 of them, were getting the best medical attention and treatment that could be provided. And since the Army was kind of slipping in that endeavor, that the people of Iowa had stepped up to try and fill that gap. And so that was one of the purposes of the trip to Fort Donelson. While Ira Gifford and Dr. McCairn were visiting the troops with the governor at Fort Donelson, Dr. Archibald and Mr. Burwell were doing the hard work. They located the steamer and got it loaded with wounded Iowans from Mound City, and they decided to go to Cincinnati, Ohio, up the Ohio River. The hospital at Mound City wasn't able to treat them, and Dr. Archibald Maxwell wanted to go to a place where it would have sufficient supplies. Cincinnati would not have been your first choice if you were trying to get the soldiers closer to home, which would have been the logical choice in most cases because you wanted to be close to where family could visit, and if a soldier was had a prolonged stay in the hospital, and also if the soldier had recovered but not recovered enough to return to his unit, those soldiers would be furloughed. And because their pay was back with the regiment on the front, probably, they usually were furloughed with whatever money they had in their pocket when they went to the hospital. And so being closer to home meant you didn't, it would be cheaper. So Cincinnati wouldn't have been your first choice from those two considerations, but from Dr. Archibald S. Maxwell's prime consideration was, let's get these wounded to a hospital that has provisions that can provide for them to ensure their recovery. Cincinnati was a great place. Why was Cincinnati so great? Cincinnati was the headquarters of the U.S. Sanitary Commission west of the Appalachians. And so all those donated supplies from the north, west of the Mississippi, were going there. They had lots of supplies and they had hospitals with room. And so from that perspective, going closer to this location, to the location where the supplies were, made lots of sense. That's why they loaded them all on the ship to take them upriver to 6 days to Cincinnati. Now the ship, the steamer, was not well provisioned by the Army. One of the first things that Dr. Archibald did was he hired a cook to make meals that the soldiers could eat. And they also dipped into the money that had been provided by the Scott County Soldiers Aid Association, and bought supplies, and they even used some of their own money to buy supplies. You know, Dr. Archibald, with all of that assistance, was able to get the wounded all the way to Cincinnati and in the care of Cincinnati hospitals without losing anyone, which, given the conditions in which he found them, was probably a fairly significant feat. After spending a few days in Cincinnati, Archibald and Mr. Burwell took different routes home, but they did go back to Davenport. Dr. Archibald brought several furloughed soldiers, so these were soldiers that had recovered enough that they didn't need to be hospitalized anymore, but hadn't recovered enough to be able to return to their units, and so they had been furloughed, and he covered their expenses to go back to Davenport. And so he returned home in March. And next time we will cover the Battle of Bloody Shiloh and Pittsburgh Landing, which is the next major action that takes place where Iowa needed to organize efforts to provide medical soldiers aid. And we will cover Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing. And fun fact, as we close here until next time, most battles in the Civil War had two names. The Union would usually name its battles for the local river that it was associated with. The South usually named the battle, if there was a railroad junction, it would name it for that, which is why Shiloh actually has two names. In the North, it was known as Pittsburgh Landing because that was the drop-off point for the steamers on the Tennessee River, and Shiloh is named for the church around which much of the battle took place by the South. So with that, until next time, look forward to seeing you all again very soon.